Kia ora koutou, ko Victoria McLennan, tōka ingoa, please call me Vic. And welcome to this Fireside chat I'm having with the fabulous Rick Shera to talk about whether New Zealand laws are up to muster as our technology environment in Aotearoa changes. And thank you everyone who's joined us. This is being recorded and it will be released. So if you can't stay the whole time or want to share it with your colleagues, there'll be a link that you'll be able to use. Now, we do have a Q&A function today. So please, if you have any questions for Rick as I go through, then pop them in the Q&A. I am on my own, so I haven't got a helper answering them, but I'll keep an eye on them as we go and try and pose your questions to Rick. We're here for about 45 minutes, so we'll be finished at about 5:15. And for anyone who's here who doesn't know, IT Professionals is the industry peak body for Aotearoa New Zealand that was formed in 1960, so we've been around a long time, formerly the New Zealand Computer Society, and we're focused on professionalism and capability, skills and talent in the career development of everyone who works in the digital technology industry. So lots of interesting things happening in that space. So first up, welcome, Rick. Thanks for joining me.
Kia ora. Thank you, Vic. Nice to be here.
Yeah, I thought you could start with a little intro about yourself so people get to know you.
A little bit of intro. As you can see from the background behind me, I'm currently in Queenstown. I work in a law firm in Auckland called Lowndes Jordan. I describe myself variously, but for these purposes, as a internet and digital business lawyer, which spans things like copyright, privacy, cybersecurity, internet generally, governance, and naturally AI now as we're spanning into AI, online harms, etc. So anything to do with the internet, as the internet has gobbled everything up in the last few decades. I'm the past Vice President of Internet NZ. I was on the establishment board for the CERT in New Zealand. I was chairman of NetSafe for probably way too long, but quite a long time, and have been involved in various other internet activities. So I'm glad to be here.
Lots happening in all of those spaces right now, and
yes.
Highly controversial things happening with the CERT at the moment, which we could probably run a whole separate session on, couldn't we?
Yeah,
what should we do? Yeah, what should we do with the cybersecurity system in New Zealand? Yeah. But we won't.
We might touch on that. I might touch on that a little bit later, but we'll see.
Okay, we'll see how we go. So to start, it would be really great. You've suggested that we go through some principles first, starting with against what should you judge any laws if you're considering whether they're fit for purpose, whether they need change?
Yeah, so I like to describe sometimes what I do is a bit like trying to pour new wine into old wine casks when technology changes and so on. You know, the old laws that we have, are they fit for purpose? What does the cask look like? Is it going to leak? Is it going to explode, etc.? So when I'm looking at that, I try and think, well, first of all, do we actually need a change in the law or a new law? And that's mainly a gap analysis. We don't want to be overbuilding existing laws or creating new laws that are inconsistent with existing laws. So that's the first thing. Then once you've sort of thought, well, there is a bit of a gap here, or there's something we need to address, obviously consultation is important, but the things I look at in terms of whether a law is fit for purpose or whether a new law is required is, is it fair and reasonable? Obviously, not everyone's going to agree with every law. In fact, that's seldom the case. But for the most part, we need laws which people are going to think, on balance, are fair and reasonable. Otherwise, they just won't fly. People won't abide by them. It'll bring the law itself into disrepute. The laws have got to be understandable. There's a lot of work being done on that. We now have plain English legislation to try and make our laws plain English. But also, increasingly, I think laws are going to need to be understandable by machines so that the machines themselves can interpret them. And that behoves us to think in terms of much more logical ways in which the laws are drafted and created and put in place. Accessibility is part of that. But also, the laws need to be certain. And from a lawyer's perspective, that's pretty important. Clients come to me and say, well, Rick, can you tell us, we're doing this new thing, capital N, capital T, nice and shiny. Can you tell us what the law is in this area and how this particular law applies? And so certainty is very important, because they'll be making investment decisions. They might be making extremely important investment decisions, building their whole life and their whole business, putting their livelihoods on the line on the basis of advice as to what the law says and what they can do or not do. Now, different people's risk appetites may apply, but in general, certainty is very important for the law. And the next principle that I think is important is the laws have got to be meaningfully enforceable. It's not much use, whilst law is a societal mechanism for setting in place what society considers as important, it's important that they be enforceable. Otherwise, it's a little bit of a waste of time. Not a complete waste of time. There is some moral suasion in law, so that not necessarily everything needs to be completely enforceable, but ultimately, if you can't enforce it, then, you know, perhaps some people are just going to ignore it. And then finally, it needs to be, in particular in this space, but in general in most spaces, it needs to be future-proofed and adaptable. And that's quite difficult for law. It's almost inconsistent with the concept of certainty and understandability for a law to be adaptable and changeable. But there are ways and means to do that. So those are the things that I look for when I'm looking for a law. And the final point, not necessarily with the law itself, but in terms of the process that New Zealand goes through to create or adapt its laws, we've got to be realistic. New Zealand is a small country in the scheme of things, and we should be, in my view, a fast follower, not try and break the mould in terms of creating new law or new opportunities for New Zealand. We should be looking to other overseas jurisdictions, some of which have been looking at a lot of these issues far more closely and in detail than us. That's not to say that we should knee-jerk pick up whatever regulation is overseas, and we should certainly adapt whatever we do decide to take on board to New Zealand conditions, to treaty and various other aspects of New Zealand, the New Zealand environment. But the reality is we should take advantage of what's happening overseas.
So let's critique a law that was passed quite recently, 3 years ago, being the Privacy Act, when we're thinking about that. So do you think the Privacy Act is doing the job that it's designed for if you were to look at it through the lens and principles that you were talking about?
Well, I think our immediate past Privacy Commissioner, John Edwards, now departed to Lords. I think I last saw him at Lords criticising someone. He said that our privacy law in 2020, when it was about to be passed, was fit for purpose for 12 years prior to that, which is when effectively the review of the privacy legislation, the 1983 Act, first commenced around 12 years earlier. So, that's the reality of the situation, is that we decided that we'd taken such a long time to get our 2020 Act in place and ready for passing, that even though in the meantime the global data, the GDPR in Europe had come into force and was represented as the gold standard, and even though our law didn't necessarily come up to scratch with that, it was deemed to be important to at least get our law in place, 2020 law in place, rather than trying to go back to the drawing board and put in place some of the things that the GDPR in particular had in place. The idea was that we would then come back quite quickly and have a look at our Privacy Act. As some of us said at the time, well, that sounds all very well, but with legislative priorities being what they are, with elections being what they are, it seems highly unlikely that we will get back to it very quickly, and so it has been. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of intention to go back, other than just tweaking a few bits and pieces which are currently underway for third-party collection of information and so on. So that's where we stand. What is it that I think the Act lacks? Well, if I go back to my standards, my principles, is it certain? and understandable. I think it's not too bad. There are some areas in the Privacy Act that probably could do with a little bit of tweaking. When you get down and dirty in some of the weeds of the legislation, you find that it's not quite as clear as one would have hoped. Things around, some quite technical issues. One issue in particular I find that is quite difficult to work through is, in terms of certainty, and this affects businesses I come across all the time, is when you're transferring personal information overseas, our legislation says, well, you can do that if there are comparable safeguards in the jurisdiction into which you're transferring. And it was always intended, I think, that the regulators, or at least that there would be regulations which would come on board to say, well, these countries are comparable, so you don't need to enter into transfer contracts or assess anything. You can take it as read that these countries are comparable. We haven't done that, so you have to sort of stick your thumb in the air and think, well, okay, Europe's probably okay. We've got an adequacy decision for New Zealand from Europe, so they must think we're okay and they're okay. Other countries which have adequacy, probably they're okay. What about Australia? Well, they don't have adequacy. Are they comparable? Well, I hesitate to suggest that they're not, because my Australian colleagues will probably criticise me heavily for saying that. But they're probably okay. But what about the United States? Europe has said, the Schrems decisions 1 and 2 have both said that US is not sufficiently protective of personal information or personal data transferred from Europe to the United States. Does that mean that they don't have comparable safeguards? So that's an area of uncertainty that is quite challenging when you've got businesses which may be transferring information overseas, and that's increasingly the case, particularly where you're locating your information in data pools in overseas jurisdictions. So that's one area. Other areas are fairly commonly understood, things like the right to be forgotten or the erasure right to remove information, the data portability right. Well, we are looking at dealing with data portability, not so much in personal information, but generally with the consumer data right legislation, which is under consultation at the moment. So everyone should have a look at that. That will be a boon for that particular area. There are a few other areas, but the most deficient area, I think, in our law is its enforceability. The idea that you cannot really enforce, there is no personal right of enforcement of the Privacy Act. You have to go to the Privacy Commission, and then if you're disgruntled with what the Privacy Commission says, you can go to the Human Rights Review Tribunal, which is a very long, drawn-out process. You can't go to court to enforce the Privacy Act yourself. And yet, most people would start now to say that privacy is a human right. So why is it that we can't enforce our own personal human rights? The second thing, of course, is that even if you can go to the Privacy Commission, all the Privacy Commissioner can do is in very limited circumstances say, well, person that you have asked for access, for example, to your personal information, we don't think that access has been given properly, so we're going to impose a compliance order on the person who hasn't complied with their access, has divulged your personal information. We're going to put a compliance order, and only then, if the agency doesn't comply with the compliance order, can the Privacy Commissioner seek, and they can't impose the fine, they can seek to impose a fine by seeking that as damages, a massive 10,000 New Zealand dollar fine. That is, with respect, well, not really with respect, that is derisory. That is not a fine, that is a license fee. You pay more than that for very many licenses that you get from our government to do various activities that you might do. In fact, one of my clients asked me whether they could have a discount for bulk. Could you have 10 breaches for $90,000? So
sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
So that is, and our current Privacy Commissioner has also made that point. So I think when we look across the Tasman to what has been the increasing level of fines over there, when we look to the GDPR, California, various other places at the levels of fines, we are just massively out of step. And that's not to say that we need necessarily fines to make people do the right thing, but when ultimately they don't do the right thing, we do need a stick in addition to the carrots.
Well, you opened the door on the Consumer Data Rights Bill, and Kim has jumped right in and said she'd love to hear Rick's thoughts on the exposure draft for the Consumer Data Rights Bill. Will it be hard to legislate for the technical standards? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, it is putting me on the spot. Thanks for that, Kim. The truthful answer is that I haven't really had much time to have a look at it. I've had plenty of other things to do. I think we are building on work that's been done overseas, which I think is the good way to do it. In all of these laws, there are some technical issues, but as I say, I haven't really had time to look at that in a lot of detail.
Maybe that's something you could look at and write us a blog. That would be great to answer Kim's question. Yeah. Now, I wanted to really quickly touch on harm before we move on to the big topics, which are really around AI. The Christchurch call was great for shining a spotlight on discussions around online harm, but was very specifically focused quite deliberately, and I think you and I were involved in some of those early discussions on the scope around elimination of terrorist and violent extremist content online. Beyond the work or the mahi of the Christchurch call, do we have enough legislation or regulatory settings designed to protect us from online harm, or is this an area that really needs some focus?
Gee, I mean, we could spend all day on this topic.
Okay, you've only got a few minutes for that.
Yeah, I've got a few minutes. I mean, I think the starting point has to be, what do we mean by harm? It's and we conflate that with things like hate speech, with misogynism, with disinformation, with misinformation. And so I think we need to be very careful to be critical of what we're actually talking about. And there is no one size fits all in this space. So to try and say, well, look, we should legislate for online harm is sort of meaningless. You need to really think about what you're legislating for. And so the Christchurch call was very, and as you said, that we were very targeted when we were thinking about that afterwards, about, well, let's pick off, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good here. Let's focus on things which everyone could agree on, and focus on that. Unfortunately, I think what has happened is that it's very difficult to divorce that from the encouragement of the direct encouragement of very harmful activity in the offline environment, things that, online encouragement of very harmful activity in the offline environment from harmful activity online per se. And as soon as you get into that, you are then right up against issues of free speech, of all of the issues that come out in these sort of discussions. So, and I don't want to get into all of that now, because I just don't, there's plenty of discussion about all of that. What I would like to highlight, though, is that for those that don't know, there is a consultation now going on in some areas, some aspects of online harm, launched by the Department of Internal Affairs, called the Safer Online Services and Media Platforms consultation. Have a look at the DIA's site, but that's interesting, because it is trying to look at online harms in with quite a wide sort of definition. Online harm, and that, if I'll just find it. It's just so that people know what I'm talking about. It's where someone experiences loss or damage to rights, property, or physical, social, emotional, and mental well-being. That's the definition of harm that is currently being consulted on. There is, it's early days, but the consultation finishes on the 31st of July, so we haven't got much time. to think about what that means. It then takes that definition of harm and says, well, we will look to regulate and set up a new regulator for unsafe content. Unsafe content being harmful content which could be harmful if experienced by someone. That's a pretty wide definition, and I suspect that there'll be quite a lot of submissions on that definition. It's in the online environment only. It doesn't necessarily mean that it, whilst it does refer to physical, it doesn't only refer to physical. So harm could be emotional, mental well-being, etc. And to briefly outline what is currently consulted on, the idea is that the government would set up an independent regulator. That regulator would take over functions that are currently run by the chief censor. So under the Film, Videos Classification Publication Act, Publication Classification Act, for objectionable material, that's highly illegal material. It would take over that. It would take over some aspects of the Broadcasting Standards Authority's work in terms of media. It would this regime would not only apply online, it would apply also to all forms of media, television, newspapers, whether they're hard copy or digital. And it would set up an independent regulator that would then look to agree with industry codes of practice applicable to what they call platforms. Now, a platform is just, in the widest possible sense, a website which provides content information. They've realistically recognised that, well, that could just about mean all of us if we have a website and it provides information. So the idea is that there would be regulated platforms which are larger, i.e. probably have around about 100,000 people who might access them each year, or 25,000 New Zealand users, and those platforms would be regulated. The regulator would have the ability to, as I say, approve these codes of practice for groups of platforms. So there might be one for social media companies, there might be one for traditional media companies, there might be one for online platforms and so on. So there could be several or more codes of practice that are agreed. And then they would monitor the compliance with those codes of practice. The regulator isn't someone who you or I could come to if I thought that the codes were being breached. We would have to complain to the platform. We might complain to the regulator, and then the regulator might ultimately say, well, you platform are not complying with your with the code of practice, and therefore we can issue a compliance notice. The other thing, as I said, they would take over from the chief censor, and the chief censor relatively recently got increased takedown powers. So for illegal material, this new independent regulator would have takedown powers, but it's not currently proposed that there would be any ex ante, so no ex ante blocking. So there would be no, you can't have this sort of information on your platform, you have to block it. It's not proposed that would be there. So I think that's an interesting piece of consultation. I think it behoves all of us to have a look at that if we're in this space. I know Internet NZ is looking at it. I know ITP is looking at it. Various others are looking at it. The interesting thing to me is that as an ex-chair of NetSafe, which is the approved agency under the Harmful Digital Communications Act, one would have expected or thought that this consultation would also look to work out how it would interact with another definition of harm, which is a very different definition of harm in that legislation. And here I come back to my principles of legislation around certainty and understandability and being fair and reasonable, because I find it difficult to see how we're going to end up if this proposal was to go through with two parallel and in many cases overlapping pieces of legislation dealing with two different process regimes, two different ways in which it's dealt with by the courts, all of which are dealing with online harm. So that seems to be a gap in it, and perhaps some people will be submitting on that.
So we're about to talk about generative AI in a moment, but it sounds to me like even as a first step, what government could do is put all the ledge into a model and actually understand where there are these overlaps and intersections, and use it for searching reasons to give them insights into where their legislative changes that they're proposing potentially would have an impact on another piece of legislation or be in contradiction. Wouldn't that be a great use case for government?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and we'll get to this with AI as well. I mean, I think there are some real interesting use cases for AI in a lot of these spaces. So, yes, in a sense, of course, we all know and have used AI, which is delivered to us. I mean, AI is not magic. It's what it does is deliver out statistically relevant or probable answers to the questions that you've asked it. It doesn't know whether they're right or wrong. And at the moment, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because often they can be wrong, particularly when I'm looking for legislation. I've asked it a number of questions and got very, very realistic answers back, which luckily enough I haven't put into any opinions, because when I actually go and look at them, I find that they're completely wrong, quoting pieces of legislation that just aren't there, and so on and so forth. It's a beta at the moment. These things are beta at the moment. So, no doubt it'll improve. But yeah, I think we have to be careful on those side of things. But I do think that proposal from DIA is going to require quite a lot of thought. I don't know that the 31st of July is going to be enough time for us to think through how exactly that's going to work and some of the unforeseen consequences that it might have in terms of harm. I know some people will have very, very strong views on whether the definition of harm is going to be a chill on free speech, for example, or goes well beyond what we would normally think of as harmful. So
maybe that's the first submission everyone could make, is please extend this time frame to enable a larger conversation. Before we move off or move forward onto other topics, there are two questions on the message on the Q&A that I'll ask you. Jumping back to the discussion about the Privacy Commissioner's powers being limited, Flash has asked if they have reserved powers to publicly name and shame in egregious cases. Does the Privacy Act allow that?
Yes, it does. It doesn't prevent it, put it that way. And certainly, if you look at some of the more, I think what's happened in recent times is one obviously good thing about the Privacy Act, and I shouldn't be too disparaging of it. One good thing about the Privacy Act is that we do have now a mandatory data breach reporting regime. And I think what you're starting to see with that is some sunlight being cast on practices and breaches and lacunae in people's management of personal information that would have been completely hidden from us previously. So, if you only have to go and look at the Privacy Commissioner's site now to see that the major latitude breach is front and centre on their site.
Thanks for that. That's great. And then the second question is on the message board that we'll which takes us off into a very different conversation though, but if you could just quickly think about it. Yeah. What considerations does our law take into account, or should it take into account, regarding data sovereignty in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty?
Yeah, I won't profess to be anywhere near an expert on this issue. It is a highly relevant factor. So, and I think as we all start to think more and more about what personal information means to each of us, we start to realise that not only is it a human right, but it's a valuable right in Maori and a taonga. That sort of concept starts whether or not you're Maori or not, or of any other race or ethnicity. I think you start to realise that personal information about each of us is very important. And so aspects of where it goes, who has control of it, which jurisdiction it rests in, start to become very important, because whilst I say, look, we need to have New Zealand laws which are understandable, when you start to go beyond New Zealand shores to other laws and other jurisdictions and other regulators, it becomes even more difficult to discern, well, who is going to have the right to see my information and who's going to have the right to do something with it. So, yeah, it's critically important. It's a discussion that we need to have for New Zealanders in Aotearoa.
Now, I've been in back-to-back meetings all day, so I'm going to change from wireless headphones, which are telling me they're going flat, to corded ones. So I'll ask you the first of my many questions about AI, because that's really the main topic people want to hear about. Do we need AI legislation here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Big open question.
Big open question. The answer is yes and no, as all these questions are. And here I guess I would come to the point that I made at the end of my statement about principles of law. I think New Zealand should be a fast follower in this area. The reality of the situation is that this is moving extraordinarily fast, and there are people, I'm not suggesting for a moment there aren't people in New Zealand who are expert in this space, but the reality is that the action is happening in jurisdictions around the world that have more resources, but particularly at the regulatory end and the policy end, than we will ever have. We just do not have the capacity, I don't think, to burrow into this issue at the level that it is already being burrowed into in other jurisdictions. And here I would particularly look at, and it's absolutely impressive, really, when you think about it, that the EU already has a piece of legislation that has gone through the EU Parliament and is now out for the typical EU negotiation process between the European Parliament and the various countries. I mean, that's breakneck speed when you think about legislative processes. The GDPR took way longer than that. That's not to say that the EU AI Act will get into place quickly. It takes a time from now on, but to have proposals which are sitting there for the rest of us to look at and think about and consider whether they would be worthwhile implementing something like that, or at least take guidance from that in New Zealand is fantastic, really. I mean, we just couldn't have done that. We haven't done that. We're at the very early stages of even really thinking about the dialogue, and yet they've got legislation now. Many people, or some people, would say, well, that's a bad thing because they've suddenly knee-jerked, and you've had 165, I think it is, business leaders in the European Union write to the European Parliament saying this is a bad thing. You're going to destroy our competitive advantage in Europe. This is regulatory overreach, etc., etc. Well, as you would expect most businesses to do when the negotiation is starting with the various countries. But I think that I think regulatory knee-jerk reactions are bad, and I often look across to our neighbours across the Tasman and wonder sometimes whether their regulation, whether they've thought as long and hard about regulation as we have to, because we don't have the resources to put the regulation in place. So I think that's good. We do need to have the discussion, though. And again, I come back to my principles of what should legislation look to do. We need to have that sort of principled discussion about what is it that we're trying to do here. I struggle with the idea that you could have, I think we have to be careful to think that we could have a law, an AI law, which spans all of the different issues that AI gives rise to in a legal context. And perhaps if we perhaps might discuss some of the legal issues that AI gives rise to, and that might inform people's thinking about whether, in fact, we could have an AI law or if we did, what the AI law would actually address.
What form should that discussion take? So do you think it should be a national conversation so we get everyone from all walks of life contributing to that discussion, or do you think there's a more targeted discussion to be had?
Vic, you will know, and I know, and others on the call will know how difficult it is to get people to engage. When you flag up some sort of very open-ended, are you concerned about AI? What do you think we should do about it? Discussion. It's very difficult to get people to engage. For better or for worse, often the sort of straw man put up a proposal and let everyone shoot it down works better. Mm-hmm. Now, that may not necessarily lead to the best outcomes, but at least it gets engagement. So I think that probably there needs to be some sort of thought given as to what we're thinking about doing here. What are we trying to address? And as I say, maybe it's as simple as saying, hey, look, the EU's done this. What do you think? If we were to do that in New Zealand, would you agree? Or, expand on that. At least there's a proposal there.
So in that, as a proposal, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. They've taken a very risk-based approach to this piece of legislation. It's really going to be really comprehensive, and they say it's going to be future-proofed. As a first follower, what kind of steps would we as a country need to take to go, yes, that is what we want to adopt, and let's adopt that? How do we assess that for our own specific cultural and context and needs as a nation, though?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Te Treaty and some of the aspects of that need to be thought through very, very carefully in terms of how that works. I think also I come back to that pithy little statement: perfect is the enemy of good in these areas. I think biting off huge topics like AI and trying to legislate across the board is very, very difficult. There's always going to be corner cases that people can bring forward to say that's not going to work. There's always going to be, AI regulation in some senses gets towards censorship. So there's those sorts of issues that arise. So I think we need to be very, very, very very limited, well, not limited, but very focused in terms of what we're actually trying to address here. And I think it is early days in terms of AI. When it reminds me a bit of, NFTs were going to be the thing that saved the world, and they're not anymore. AI was going to be the thing that killed us all or saved us all. Well, it's not that either. It's, it's a tool. It's somewhere in the middle. Is it a paradigm shift? Well, it's early days to think about that. Many people would say that it is. Many people would say it's not. So, I think we need to be careful to look at this. If we step back, let's say we step back 30, 40, 50 years ago or 30, 40 years ago to the start of the internet, and we were in the position now, would we be saying, look, we need to regulate this damn internet thing? And there were people who were saying that, of course, Max Bradford and others at the time, if I remember rightly. And we didn't do that. Now, has that been a good thing? Most people would say that not clamping down on the internet and shutting it down completely is probably on balance been a good thing. Certainly there are things which we could have done better, and we're struggling to retrofit some of our laws and principles to an internet now. As I've said, we've talked about the harmful online harms environment, which is an area where obviously we didn't get up to speed enough with what the internet might develop into, and now we're having to retrofit that onto very, very large corporations who are bigger than New Zealand in terms of their resource and muscle. So I think we do need to be focused in this area.
So those really large corporations are also, they're crying foul of this EU AI Act and calling for it all to slow down and a lot more consultation. But then on the other hand, we have, as you say, 165 organisations in the kind of the mastermind of ChatGPT, Sam Altman, and investors like Elon Musk saying, yes, please regulate us. We need regulation. What do we make of all of that? Is it all just discourse that's just out there and the media have leapt on it and it's confusing, or is there something in there that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think we should, don't get me wrong, I think there is going to need to be legislation in this area. There is going to need to be law, because there are things that AI is doing that need to be restrained. No question about that. What we need to be very careful about, obviously, with regulation is that it doesn't have unforeseen consequences, and in particular doesn't cement in place the dominance that some of these large organisations already have by imposing overly onerous regulatory requirements on everybody when small players just can't keep up with it. The large players will adapt. They have, notwithstanding Mr. Musk's gutting of his health and safety team at Twitter, they will adapt. They have the resources to apply to regulatory responses. They have the resources to fight regulatory enforcement actions. Smaller players just don't have that. So when you have to be very careful when you impose regulation that you just don't cement the dominance of the dominant players. And that's, I'm a lawyer, so naturally enough, I'm a cynic. That just goes without saying. So, when I see large organisations say, yes, we'd love some regulation and we'd like to help you draft it, I wonder what that regulation is going to look like and whether in fact it is going to cement their dominance.
And I guess that just highlights all the other topics we haven't talked about today because we've run out of time, like the code, like the cyber security environment. There's a whole lot of other topics. So I'd love to get you back to talk about all of these.
Yeah, I mean, there's one area that I think we often overlook, and that's scams. Yeah. I think it's great that we're looking at online harms. It really is. It's really good, and it's good that we're looking at AI and so on. But there are people who are losing their livelihoods as we speak with online scams, and there is diddly squat that they can do about it. There is no real regulatory response to that. There are disparate resources, disparate regulators and so on around, and this is where I come back to your earlier comment about CERT being I was going to say gold up. That's probably the pejorative. Being subsumed in the GCSB or NCSC regime, and that's public information now, so I'm not speaking out of turn, but that it's being thought about. I shouldn't say that it's going to happen. It's being thought about, and no doubt people will have different views on it. But something has to be done in this area. It is not good enough for example, NetSafe, which I was chair of, became the default place for people to complain about scams simply because it has a call centre. And
woefully under-resourced by the government.
It's not, NetSafe is not meant to be doing that. It's not resourced to do that. It's resourced for educational and for the Harmful Digital Communications Act. It's not meant to be handling scams. And yet there is no one who really people can talk to about a scam. And there is, I really do think that we've got to the stage of saying, is it good enough that we blame the victim for not securing their device, accidentally clicking on a link, not giving the right password to a bank, not getting in touch with their bank soon enough before their money has gone through a mule to somewhere else and it can't be recovered? I honestly just don't think that's good enough. And I think we need to look at that in terms of a regulatory response to it.
It's an amazing point to make and a great note to end on. And I think, you've opened up so many different topics that we could run more of these just to deep dive into. For anyone who's watching, if you haven't seen it, there's a Nigel Latter TV show about scams. And I don't watch TV these days, but I've been watching it on TVNZ On Demand. And it's certainly good to see that there's this forum that people who don't necessarily work in our sector and work with digital technology can start to get some information about scams and the psychology of them. So good to pick that up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't see the program. I'm ambivalent about such programs. Sometimes they often seem to be sort of create a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt without any resolution. And as I say, what I'm very concerned about is that there is this tendency to suggest that it's up to us to secure our own devices. A phone or a computer is one of the most powerful pieces of technology and most complicated pieces of technology there is. And yet you're asking individuals at all ages and stages and technological adeptness to combat what is increasingly going to be an AI-driven attempt at getting them to give their information to someone else or accessing their information. I just don't think that's there.
Well, maybe we could give that feedback to DIA in our consultation response to the Safer Online Services and Media Platforms Framework, that there is this whole area of scams that also needs to be addressed. Yeah. Conscious of time, thank you so much, Rick, for joining me. Fascinating, just as fascinating as I imagined. So much to cover and probably so much more we could have discussed. And I really appreciate that. And you asking these questions on the fly from the audience, which is great. And
we haven't even talked about copyright.
Oh, I know. We haven't even got to the guts. And I would have thought Kim would have been asking a copyright question, actually. Yeah. We haven't even got to the guts of that. So maybe we'll book a follow-up and talk about some of these other more targeted topics. I appreciate you joining me, and thanks to everyone who's been here listening. Really appreciate you giving up your time to come and listen to this. Hope you found it as fascinating as I did. And I'll let you all get on with your evening. So ka kite.